So I told you that 2.5 years following the disaster, we had like this very shocking data on post-traumatic stress. So our strategy, and it worked, so that's why I'm sharing it with you. We decided to organize a big press conference to make sure that everybody would be aware of the situation. And it was not really appreciated from the local population at the beginning. So of course, before sharing these results publicly, we had a special meeting with the citizens and the local partners to share the results. But there was a purpose behind this. Okay, the purpose was I was preparing my strategy. Then, of course, after releasing these results, people were a little bit affected by these bad results. So we decided to organize very quickly, so the month after, a big day of reflection with some 50 key actors of the community, including citizens groups, associations, schools, community organism, private sector, municipal authorities, and so on. And it really worked well. So through the day, we were able to look at the route we had traveled, but more importantly, we were able to look at the future. How do we see ourselves in 10 years? So, you know, we were able to develop our common visions of the community, a positive vision. And by the end of the day, we were able to identify what would be the main components of an action plan to promote community resilience. All of this only in one day, so that's feasible. But the most important thing is that given that we had very shocking data, like science-based data, and we had the community mobilization going on, we put these two types of evidence together, and we did some advocacy at the provincial level, asking for additional resources to support the action plan proposed by the community. And I was not expecting a positive answer, honestly. I just tried, okay? And I remember the Minister of Health, he asked us, how many studies are you going to do in the future? Are you going to pursue your studies? I said, yes, if necessary. If I receive what I want, maybe I'll stop. But I mean, if I need to prove again and again that the needs are still there, I'm going to do other studies. He said, who? Okay. How much do you want? Can you repeat the question? So I said, basically, I would like to have an outreach team, like a full outreach team that would work outside hospital and clinics full-time. So of course, I didn't want to take the existing social workers and psychologists out of the hospitals because the needs were still there within the clinics. So I asked for 3 full-time persons, and he said yes. I said, okay, for how many years? He said, permanent outreach team, but don't bother me again. Yeah, that's a true story. And one month after that, the Red Cross just learned that,
well, it's to go ahead what you're speaking. When you had up there a question about, well, how do we rebuild, and maybe back a slide or two, one more, the reconstruction of land use planning, infrastructure, transportation, housing, and so forth. What about like regulatory and judicial reform issues? Judicial reform, laws and responsibilities, and an understanding of basically where does the responsibilities for all this risk reduction, who has to do it and who has to be involved? I mean, it's one thing to go out there and maybe ask for advocacy. It's another thing, you know, the railroad evaporated, literally, you know, declared bankruptcy, and you have to get a treaty action to talk to people in the U.S. that own the railroad. How can, I know that there was demand for some responsibility. Where does that fit in?
I think it's under each of the components because, you know, public politics and regulatory, it's related to each of these systems. So here are more about the systems, but who's in charge of this? I think that's the main question, because I think that's the problem with recovery. who's in charge of recovery. In Lac-Megantic, we didn't find who, until we played some kind of central role, and we just played this role because nobody was playing it. But it was so obvious that it's the public health role.
So when you now are working with the community to increase resilience, and you mentioned giving them more say over what happens there, isn't, and you take some small section of an area of a province, and for like just the whole Twin Cities mega area that has no central government within a state, one of 50 or so, and how do you get the authority to deal with railroads?
I think that in the ideal world, having such a bottom-up approach, having like local committee, citizen committee, working very closely with the local authorities, this kind of initiative should exist everywhere, because risks are everywhere. Maybe not technological risk or train-related risk, but still, I don't know any community who's protected against risk, So, and as proposed by the Sendai framework, we need to get prepared. Ideally, we wouldn't wait for the disaster to happen before acting, and the response is going to be much better if we're already working all together. So, my ideal solution would be to create these committees, and this is not something very expensive. I mean, in fact, it's almost free. You just need to find volunteers and some champions, and I think that's quite feasible. The main problem is the openness of the authorities for that kind of committee. Because if it's not related to the authorities, it's not going to be so useful. So they need to realize that increasing civic participation, of course, it's going to add some complexity to their decisions, but so it might be a little bit longer, more complex, but since the dialogue with the community members is on an ongoing basis, I think that at the end of the day, the decisions are going to be easier to take, because once they will be taken, it will be made in coherence with what really wants the community, So most of the time, that's the opposite. We, as decision makers, we take decisions from a top-down approach, and then it's everywhere in the media, and we see a lot of groups reacting against the decisions, and so this is not a constructive way of doing things. So we need to convince them that in the long term, it's going to be more painful to learn working with the community before taking the decision and not after.
Was there ever a question with, I don't know, the federal government that they would bypass Lac-Megantic with the train? Because it seems like this community has suffered so hugely, and your research really brings that home that several years later, people have even higher levels of anxiety and PTSD. So was that ever a question, and is that still a possibility?
Oh yeah. 1 or 2 weeks ago, our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, wrote on Twitter that we will have a bypass on a railroad. So he committed himself on Twitter, so I don't know the value. And you know what, people complain about it, they said, wow, he's doing like Trump. Total reaction to Lac-Megantic.
You have one difference though.
Oh,
if
more
he's
than
the
one.
prime minister, right, he's the head of the majority party, so he is also in the legislature. Yes, so.
But yeah, we're working very closely with the local political leaders, and they're all aware, and even Justin Trudeau has been, is aware of the results of the finding of our studies. Also I think, that's the main question actually. Everybody's talking about the bypass railroad question. It has been ongoing, this question, for the past 3-4 years. we had a lot of work behind this question, but the thing is that it's going to be very, very expensive. Like, we have different scenarios, but it can be very expensive. But one thing that I discovered over the past year, because at the beginning I was like, that's obvious, we need a bypass railroad. To me, it was not even a question, because we have 2/3 of the local population that is traumatized and being re-exposed every day to the source of their traumatism, okay? So to me, it was obvious. And then we had to formulate our specific recommendations in a report. And we were just thinking about that. And over years, you know, I was just thinking about this money. And I was just, let's say that you give 30 or 20 millions to the community. Would it really be the best way of diminishing the distress and the suffering? And asking myself this question, I wasn't sure about it for two reasons. So with this money, we could do many local initiatives. Our data were also showing, I didn't have time to show it to you, but our data were showing that even in the group that feels secure in their neighborhoods, there's still a large part of the population showing signs of distress and psychological post-traumatic stress, you know? So do you think that a bypass railroad would help these people if they feel secure anyway? So, you know, that kind of ethical questions. And the other thing that is a major issue to me is that this is one thing to leave the railroad world where it is, because historically it has been there and that's life. And it's another thing to move it, because you can imagine that in surrounding areas, nobody wants the railroad road. No, so ethically speaking, I think it's a real issue, because, you know, leaving things as they used to be versus moving, so acting purposely and moving the railroad. So what I observed in the local community is that this kind of tension that was growing between the Lac-Megantic citizens and the citizens from surrounding municipalities that would potentially be affected by this change. So what we decided as a public health organization is not being for or against it, but just, you know, showing the principles and our thought very transparently. And just, again, I think that we're not there to take the decision for, but we're there to help people to take the right decision for themselves. So,
I'm wondering if you could in some way monetize the total loss. And the reason I ask this is because this a particular situation that we're looking at now, which is the Southwest Rail, where we already have the unit trains of ethanol, and now they want to put an electric train right next to it.
okay.
So we already have this. And the people who are most motivated to tune into the safety issues, surprisingly, are the railroads, because they are the ones who are looking to protect themselves financially. It's the government people who are saying, oh, it can't happen here, everything's taken care of. So, you know, people tend to pay attention to things when they cost money. That's what's motivating the railroads. So, can you just give some idea of the magnitude of total cost that the Lac-Megantic event represents?
Somebody told, did you, because I think you know it better than I do, because I'm not sure, 400 million.
I probably don't need this. Maybe others in the room who know too, but it seems like some time ago I read that the valuation of loss of property was somewhere around $400 million. But it's kind of murky because there's back and forth with the insurance companies in terms of figuring out, you know, what it's really going to be. But
So there's also loss of life.
and that's not
It's
including
a loss of property.
Yeah, I can't put a cost to that,
And
right?
there's
So
psychological services.
That's interesting though, because at the United Nations, I've been working during my sabbatical with people at the United Nations and World Health Organization, and they're specifically working on indicators to measure the impacts on livelihood, you know, and they're having a hard time how can we measure it and how can we standardize this so that we can compare one disaster to another? So this is easier to say than to do, because how can we, measure the impact of all this distress?
There's one other metric, is the energy in joules that a barrel of oil produces versus the energy in joules that a human lifetime produces. And that accident cost 2,000 something lives in joule energy over the course of a person's average lifetime. So that 47,000 died. I'm sorry, the 6 million liters that was spilled, you can convert it to 2,000 lifetimes.
First time I hear it. Thanks. That's why you're more knowledgeable than I am for some aspects. I just don't know who raised the end first.
Before we get a question, I know that we're running short on time, so we need to
But I
actually
think
be out
I
of
can
here.
stop the presentation.
Are you done with what you
Yeah.
needed to cover?
Yeah, I'm
And
gonna
then we
leave
wanted
it.
Claire had at least some follow-ups,
Okay,
and I know we have a few other questions that we have to
Oh,
but
yeah.
um,
Still have 10 minutes.
just wanted to make sure we're honoring, because they're going to
So
kick
I
us
let
out.